There's a single identifiable moment inside a narcissist's confidence where something structural gives way, not gradually, not as part of a slow decline you could watch unfold over months, but a specific, locatable point where the entire performance briefly, involuntarily cracks. It happens faster than people expect, and it happens for a reason most people don't anticipate. Today, we're going to identify exactly what that moment is, what triggers it, and why it looks so different from what you'd probably imagine if you pictured a narcissist's confidence breaking in the way that phrase usually gets used. Let's start by being precise about what we're actually describing, because confidence breaking can mean several different things, and only one of them is what we're focused on today. We're not talking about a slow erosion of self-esteem over years, which we've discussed in earlier videos as one possible long-term consequence of accumulating relational failures. We're talking about something much more immediate and much more specific, a single moment, often lasting only seconds, where the performed confidence a narcissist maintains almost constantly, briefly, visibly fails, exposing something underneath it that's usually kept carefully hidden, even from the narcissist's own conscious awareness. Here's what makes this moment so specific and so identifiable once you understand what to look for. It doesn't happen during confrontation, even intense confrontation, and it doesn't happen during obvious rejection, even painful rejection. Both of those situations, however uncomfortable, are ones a narcissist's psychology has extensive practice managing. Confrontation gets met with counter-accusation or reframing. Rejection gets processed through the externalization and narrative reconstruction we've discussed throughout this series. The moment we're actually describing today happens somewhere else entirely, in a situation their psychology has almost no practiced response for, which is exactly why the crack, when it happens, is so visible and so involuntary. The exact moment is this. It's the specific instant a narcissist realizes in real time, during an actual conversation, that someone who used to react to them, who used to flinch, soften, argue, plead, or in any way visibly respond to what they said or did, simply isn't reacting anymore, right in front of them, without warning, in a moment they weren't braced for. This is worth distinguishing carefully from the gradual realization of sustained absence we discussed in an earlier video, which unfolds slowly over weeks of silence. What we're describing today is different. It's an in-person or real-time moment, often unexpected, where the absence of reaction happens live, directly in front of them, and they don't have the luxury of processing it privately over time before responding. Here's why this specific live moment produces such a different, more visible effect than the same realization arriving gradually through sustained silence. When silence stretches over weeks or months, a narcissist has time to construct defenses, test the silence indirectly, gradually build a story that makes sense of what's happening before they ever have to fully absorb it all at once. A live moment offers no such runway. It requires an immediate response, in real time, to information their psychology hasn't had any opportunity to prepare for, and this is precisely why the crack becomes visible in ways it usually doesn't during the more gradual, drawn-out version of this same underlying realization. Let's walk through what this actually looks like in practice, because it's worth understanding the specific observable signs, since this moment, brief as it is, tends to produce a genuinely recognizable physical and behavioral signature if you know what to watch for. The first sign is a barely perceptible pause, a half-second delay before their next line, occurring specifically in a spot where their usual rhythm would have produced an immediate response. This pause is worth understanding as genuinely significant because narcissists, particularly skilled ones, typically operate with remarkably fast conversational reflexes, rarely leaving space for genuine hesitation. A pause appearing exactly where a reaction from you should have been, but wasn't, reflects a genuine momentary processing gap. Their script, built around an expected response, has hit a line that doesn't exist, and there's a brief, visible moment where the next line hasn't been generated yet. The third sign, and this is often the most reliably identifiable one once you know to look for it, is a specific kind of overcorrection that follows almost immediately after the pause and the vocal searching we just described, because the moment itself feels destabilizing to them, even though they likely couldn't articulate exactly why. The instinctive response is usually to reassert control quickly and forcefully, often through some version of increased intensity, a sharper tone, a more pointed comment, sometimes an abrupt change of subject delivered with unusual force. This overcorrection is worth understanding specifically as evidence of the crack, not as evidence that it didn't happen. A narcissist whose confidence genuinely wasn't affected by your lack of reaction wouldn't need to overcorrect at all. The intensity of the correction is itself proportional to the size of the destabilization it's compensating for. Here's what's genuinely worth understanding about why this specific moment produces such a visible reaction. When so many other, seemingly larger threats to a narcissist's confidence get absorbed and managed without any comparable visible crack, it comes down to something we've discussed throughout this entire series. Their sense of self is built externally, moment to moment, from the reactions of the people around them. This means their confidence isn't actually a stable, internally generated thing that occasionally gets challenged from outside. It's continuously being assembled in real time from a steady stream of external feedback, and a live, unexpected absence of that feedback occurring in a specific moment they weren't prepared for represents a genuine momentary gap in the very material their confidence is made of, not simply an emotional disappointment they need to process and move past. This is worth understanding through a specific analogy that clarifies why this moment differs so much from other kinds of rejection or confrontation a narcissist has extensive practice managing. Imagine someone whose sense of physical balance depends entirely on constant, real-time feedback from a specific sensory input, and now imagine that input suddenly, unexpectedly disappearing mid-motion without warning in a moment they weren't braced for. The disorientation in that moment isn't really about the content of what's missing in any abstract sense. It's about the immediate physical destabilization of losing something their system was actively relying on moment to moment, without any conscious awareness of how dependent they'd become on it until it wasn't there. This is precisely why the moment we're describing today produces such a specific, visible reaction, distinct from the slower, more manageable process of realizing sustained absence over time. The live version doesn't allow for gradual adjustment. It requires their system to process a genuine gap in real-time input immediately without preparation, and the crack we've described, the pause, the vocal searching, the overcorrection, is simply what that immediate processing looks like from the outside, before their more practiced, longer-term defenses have had time to fully engage and take over. Here's what's worth understanding about what typically happens in the minutes and hours immediately following this specific moment, because the crack itself, brief as it is, doesn't represent the end of the story. It represents the beginning of a much more familiar sequence we've discussed extensively throughout this series. Once the immediate live crack has passed, and their more practiced defenses have had time to engage, the narrative reconstruction process typically begins, usually within hours or days, converting what actually happened, a genuine, visible loss of composure triggered by your unexpected lack of reaction, into a story that requires less ongoing psychological cost to maintain. This often involves recasting the interaction as one where you were being deliberately provocative, cold, or manipulative, rather than acknowledging what actually occurred. A genuine, unscripted moment where their performed confidence briefly, involuntarily failed to hold. This is worth understanding specifically because it explains something that can be genuinely confusing if you witness this crack directly, and then, afterward, Watch the narcissist behave as though nothing significant happened at all, sometimes even acting more confident and more dismissive than before the moment occurred. This apparent overcorrection into even greater confidence afterward isn't evidence the crack wasn't real. It's evidence of exactly the reconstruction process we've discussed throughout this series, working specifically to convert genuine destabilization into a story that restores, at least on the surface, whatever confidence was momentarily lost during that specific, brief, live encounter with your unexpected lack of reaction. Part 3. So, what does understanding this exact moment actually mean for you, especially if you're currently in a relationship where you're beginning to build exactly this kind of genuine, unscripted indifference, or if you've already witnessed something like this crack happen and are trying to make sense of what you saw? Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. Recognizing this moment for what it is doesn't mean you should go looking for it or treat producing it as some kind of goal to actively pursue. This distinction matters enormously, and it connects directly to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series. If witnessing this crack becomes something you're consciously working toward, measuring your own progress by whether you've successfully produced it, you've reintroduced exactly the kind of external orientation that makes genuine indifference so much harder to build in the first place. The crack we've described today only happens because your lack of reaction is genuinely unscripted, unprepared, arising naturally from real internal change rather than from a calculated performance designed specifically to catch them off guard. The moment you start performing indifference specifically to produce this reaction, you've moved from genuine internal stability back into exactly the kind of strategic engagement that a narcissist's psychology, remarkably attuned to detecting underlying investment, tends to sense and eventually locate a way to work around. Here's the second thing worth understanding, and it's perhaps more useful for your own peace than any specific detail about their internal experience. If you do happen to witness this crack, whether once or repeatedly, understand that it doesn't actually change anything fundamental about the relationship or the person you're dealing with. This is worth being honest about because it would be easy to interpret a visible moment of destabilization as evidence of some deeper vulnerability that might eventually lead to genuine change if only you continue engaging long enough to help them work through it. The crack we've described today is a momentary structural failure in a performance. It isn't the same as genuine insight, genuine accountability, or the beginning of real, lasting transformation, all of which require exactly the kind of sustained internal work we've discussed throughout this series as remarkably rare, regardless of how visible or dramatic any single moment of destabilization might appear. This is worth understanding clearly because witnessing this crack can sometimes produce a specific, understandable impulse in an empath watching it happen, a flicker of hope that this might be the moment finally where something genuinely shifts, where the person underneath the performance finally becomes visible and accessible in some lasting way. I want to address this hope directly and honestly because it deserves a clear answer rather than false comfort. The crack itself is real, and it does represent a genuine, momentary failure of the performance that's usually so carefully maintained. But a crack, however real, is not the same thing as a foundation being rebuilt. Most of the time, based on everything we've discussed throughout this entire series, the crack gets quickly patched over through exactly the reconstruction process we described. And the underlying pattern continues largely unchanged, regardless of how genuinely destabilizing that specific brief moment actually was while it was happening. Here's what actually matters, more than any specific insight about what this crack reveals about their internal experience. Your capacity to produce this kind of genuine, unscripted indifference, not performed, not strategic, but real, arising from actual internal change, is itself the entire point, regardless of whether it ever produces a visible crack you get to witness, and regardless of what happens afterward if you do happen to witness one. This moment, when it occurs, isn't actually meant to be evidence you collect about their internal state. It's simply a natural, sometimes visible byproduct of you having done the real work this entire series has been describing throughout every video, building a version of yourself whose stability, whose emotional responses, and whose sense of worth no longer depend on continuously reacting to someone whose entire psychology was built around depending on exactly that reaction to feel stable and real. If you're currently in the process of building this genuine indifference yourself, and you happen to witness a moment like the one we've described today, the pause, the vocal searching, the overcorrection that follows, I want you to notice it, if you notice it at all, simply as confirmation that your own internal work is genuinely, structurally real rather than performed. Don't chase it. Don't measure your progress by whether you're successfully producing it. And don't mistake it, if it happens, for evidence that something fundamental has shifted on their side, because in almost every case, it hasn't, regardless of how genuine and visible that specific brief moment actually was. What matters in the end was never actually their crack. It was always only your own genuine, hard-won stability, real enough now that it doesn't require their reaction, their acknowledgement, or even their awareness in order to remain exactly permanently true. There's something else worth understanding here because it addresses a question that often surfaces once people start recognizing this pattern in their own lives. What do you actually do in the moment itself if you happen to be present when this crack occurs? This is worth answering directly because the instinct many empaths report in this exact situation is a kind of reflexive discomfort, an urge to soften the moment, to fill the silence that follows their visible destabilization, to somehow make the awkwardness of watching someone's composure briefly fail feel less uncomfortable for everyone involved, including them. This instinct is worth naming clearly because it's exactly the same instinct that's likely kept you accommodating difficult behavior throughout much of this relationship, and recognizing it as it arises in this specific moment matters enormously for whether your indifference remains genuine or quietly collapses back into the old pattern of managing their emotional state. The most useful response if you find yourself present for this exact moment is usually simply to do nothing at all. No rescue, no filling the silence, no offering an explanation for your lack of reaction, no attempt to smooth over what just happened. This isn't coldness for its own sake. It's the natural, undisturbed continuation of exactly the genuine indifference that produced the crack in the first place. If you rush to fill the gap, to explain yourself, to reassure them in any way, you've effectively handed back the exact reactive engagement your absence had just momentarily denied them, which undoes the entire significance of the moment almost as quickly as it occurred. Simply allowing the pause to exist, allowing their overcorrection to happen without your intervention, allowing the moment to pass without your active management of it, is the most genuinely protective thing you can do, both for maintaining the integrity of your own boundary and for avoiding the trap of unconsciously reverting to old patterns the instant discomfort arrives. It's also worth addressing something that might feel confusing or even guilt-inducing if you witness this crack directly: the temptation to interpret your own indifference as having caused harm, as though your genuine, unscripted lack of reaction was somehow an act of cruelty rather than simply the honest, natural state of someone who has finally fully released the need to manage another person's emotional experience. This is worth examining carefully because it reveals a subtle but important distinction. You are not responsible for maintaining someone else's confidence, especially not a confidence that was, by its very structure, dependent on your continued emotional labor to remain stable. Their crack in this specific moment isn't evidence that you did something wrong. It's evidence that a system depending on an unsustainable, one-directional flow of emotional input finally, briefly, encountered its own natural limitation and that limitation was never actually your responsibility to prevent or soften, regardless of how uncomfortable it might feel to witness in the moment it happens. I want to address one more piece of this because it's genuinely important for how you carry this understanding forward into future relationships, not just this specific one. The capacity to remain genuinely unreactive in a live, real-time moment, like the one we've described today, isn't something that develops quickly. And it isn't something you should expect of yourself before you've actually done the deeper internal work this entire series has been describing. If you find yourself in an actual live moment like this, still experiencing the old pull toward reactivity, still feeling the urge to soften, explain, or manage what's happening, that isn't evidence of failure. It's simply evidence that you're still in the process of building something that takes real sustained time to fully develop, and expecting yourself to arrive at complete effortless indifference before you've actually done the underlying work sets up exactly the kind of unfair all-or-nothing standard we've cautioned against throughout this entire series. This is worth understanding as a skill that develops in layers, much like every other capacity we've discussed across this series. The first layer is usually intellectual recognition, understanding as you now do what this moment looks like and why it happens, even before you're able to consistently produce genuine indifference in live, unscripted situations. The second layer is partial, inconsistent practice, moments where you successfully hold genuine stillness, interspersed with moments where the old reactive pattern still takes over, particularly under unusual pressure or exhaustion. The third layer, which takes the longest to develop and which most people building this capacity never fully complete with every single person in their life, is the kind of deep automatic stability that no longer requires conscious effort to maintain, even in unexpected, high-pressure, live situations like the one we've described throughout this discussion. Wherever you currently sit within these layers, understand that the goal was never actually to reach some final permanent state of flawless indifference that never wavers under any circumstance. It was always simply to keep moving in the direction of greater internal stability, layer by layer, trusting that the capacity to remain genuinely unreactive in live, unscripted moments will continue to deepen with practice, the same way any other difficult, worthwhile skill develops over time rather than arriving all at once, fully formed, the moment you first understand the concept intellectually. And if you never witness a moment exactly like the one described in this video, if your own genuine indifference develops entirely through the slower, more private process of sustained silence, rather than through any dramatic, visible, real-time crack, understand that this doesn't mean your own internal work is somehow less complete or less real. The crack we've described today is simply one possible visible byproduct of genuine internal change. It isn't a required checkpoint you need to pass through in order to know your own healing is genuine. Many people build exactly the kind of stability we've discussed throughout this entire series without ever witnessing a single dramatic, observable moment like the one described here. And their healing is no less complete, no less real, and no less worth honoring for having unfolded quietly, privately, without ever producing a moment dramatic enough to witness directly. Thanks for watching.